Andrew Tatarsky, PhD, is an internationally recognized leader in the treatment of problematic substance use and the psychobiosocial process model for understanding it. He's developed Integrative Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, IHRP, as an effective treatment for the full spectrum of substance use issues. Andrew is founder and director of the Center for Optimal Living in New York City, a treatment and professional training center based on IHRP. He specialized in the field of substance use treatment for over 35 years, working as a counselor, psychologist, program director, trainer, advocate, and author.
We have to have more and more ways of educating the public, of educating our country. And I think it's also a global challenge. In a new, more kind of expansive, more complex way of understanding what we call addiction. You know, this idea that addiction is not simply a biological disease, it's not simply a spiritual disease. It is a multiply determined, very complex process that, you know, that I think is really we could think of it as reflecting this complex interplay of biological, psychological, relationship, and cultural and social factors that interact in ways that are unique for each person, giving rise to this addictive response, essentially to suffering. And there's all sorts of ways that we humans suffer. And when that suffering becomes unbearable, we turn desperately to ways of trying to manage and comfort and stay sane in the moment that may have terribly harmful consequences. But in the moment when we have no other options, we're going to turn there. And that's a different way of thinking about addiction as a response to suffering that then can become deeply ingrained and encoded in the brain and in habit and in all of our relationships. But this new model, I think, offers a very different way of thinking about helping people make positive change that I think is much more hopeful. Because if we can identify the various strands of suffering, of biological impact, of habit, the changes in the brain, that we can rewire, we can then come up with a whole variety of solutions that I think can inspire hope. So I think getting this idea out that there's a different way of thinking about this that implies lots and lots of new tools and strategies and ways that we can support people in making change is what is going to ultimately support a scientific revolution. People that we love and people that we care about are dying. I mean, we're all in this to save lives and to save qualities of life and to save people that are suffering and struggling. Or maybe we're not saviors, we're not here to save, but we're here to make options available to people that will be more acceptable and palatable to people kind of wherever they're struggling. And I think that that's what unifies all of the addiction treatment approaches at their best, is that we're all in this for the love of the people that are suffering and motivated by a compassionate desire to support people in beginning to heal and kind of end their suffering. And if that means for some people it's safer practices, if it means for other people it's reduced use and increased quality of life, and for others it's complete and total abstinence and 12-step recovery, it's all good. And I think another fundamental shift that I see that's happening right now is the idea that we need to offer people opportunities for support to begin moving in a positive direction wherever they're ready to begin that process. And the traditional abstinence-only approaches, which have dominated the field, have really, in effect, limited access to care to the overwhelming majority of people that are suffering. And I think it comes from a very complicated history, which at one point, when I think the medical profession abandoned addicted people, and AA was born as a mutual support group of people helping people. It was the only game in town. It was the only place that addicted people could come and feel safe and supported and accepted, one day at a time, with just the desire to stop drinking. And I think that we've moved beyond that. And I don't think, I'm a psychologist. I have developed Integrative Harm Reduction Psychotherapy. I think it's a radical alternative to abstinence-only work. But I don't see it as being at odds with 12-step recovery. 12-step recovery is, and the 12-step programs are an incredibly wonderful, life-saving tradition and community for many, 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 many people.
Tell me about the world as it existed when you were passionate about the idea of coming into this field and being part of it.
When I was in graduate school for clinical psychology, for some interesting coincidence, I happened to see a number of patients while I was in training who were struggling with drugs and alcohol. So over the course of 4 years, I kept seeing folks that were struggling. And I really hadn't imagined that I would be working in the addictions field, but the experience of working with these people was so, on the one hand, rewarding, and on the other hand, it really challenged sort of a lot of misinformation and stigmatizing ideas that I think we all grew up with in this culture, that these folks can't be treated in psychotherapy, or that they somehow were a different kind of person. In this culture, there's a certain almost unexamined cultural narrative about people who struggle with drugs and alcohol, who have addictive, what I think of as addictive relationships to drugs and alcohol, that they're somehow other. They lie, they manipulate, they steal, they're unreliable, they, on and on and on. It's like a narrative of a person that you would not want to have anything to do with. And you certainly wouldn't want somebody you love to get to be involved with them. I think that this stigmatizing narrative is like soaked into the fabric of this culture. And of course we all grew up with it, which is really interesting to think about how that narrative has been internalized by people that struggle with addictions, let alone everyone else, and how that affects how people feel. So I had a series of experiences with people that were struggling with substances that really challenged that stigmatizing narrative. And I thought, this is a wonderful, diverse group of people that were struggling with one thing or another and substances. And it struck me that there was very, very little out there that was really effective helping. So I finished my clinical training, and actually when I was in college, I had worked my way through college working with developmentally disabled people. So I kind of thought that that was the direction that I was going to go in. In fact, I got a job at a major developmental disabilities organization. And before I actually started the job, I saw this little advertisement for an addiction treatment center in East Harlem here in New York City. And something about that ad just kind of drew my attention. And I called them up, sent a resume, they invited me in. I was interviewed by 5 people, and at the end of the day they offered me the job. So that was an unforeseen step for me to take. But so at the time, I was introduced to the dominant narrative about addiction treatment, which was disease model, that is Jelinek's disease model, abstinence-only treatment. And as I've come to understand it, it's sort of a single narrative about addiction and recovery. I learned that model. I worked within that model for the first 8 years of my career. In fact, I worked in several different organizations. I became the clinical director in the late 80s of a premier intensive outpatient program in New York City that was based on that model. And I think we helped a lot of people. But what I began to see is that the overwhelming majority of the people that were coming to our treatment programs were not sticking, were not stopping, and in many cases we were discharging them for using drugs, which was the standard. And in many parts of the country it still is. And I began to have this increasing experience of like cognitive dissonance. Like the model is saying this person isn't ready for treatment, the person is suffering and wants help. And I'm being instructed basically to discharge them from care. I had a series of experiences of actually doing that and began to feel that I was victimizing or traumatizing my patients. And with this growing sense of shame, guilt, discomfort, anxiety, I began to question the model. And this is now, we're talking the late 80s. At that time, people thought if you're not enforcing abstinence, you're enabling people. You're colluding with the disease. So, but my direct experience was telling me that there's something wrong with this picture. So I started a private practice in the late 80s, my own little practice, and I began getting referrals of active substance-using patients who seemed motivated for care but were not ready to stop. And I thought, this is not really working for lots of people. Let me try to break the rules. So I figured I'm going to throw out the abstinence requirement. I'm going to just accept people on their own terms. And lo and behold, I found that many of these folks engaged meaningfully in care, in therapy. Many of them cut back or stopped their substance use, addressed other issues. And so now I was in this theoretical and almost moral crisis where the dominant model seemed to be very limited in its effectiveness, and breaking the rules was actually working for many people. Just a measure of the failure or the limitations of abstinence-only treatment is what had been a kind of common thing to say in rehabs, with a group of folks sitting around in a circle. Look to your left, look to your right. Only one of the 10 of you is going to make it. Like this is the level of success that was acceptable. And I thought, maybe we're blaming the patient or the client or the struggling person for the failure of the model. So now breaking the rules is working for me, and I began to ask around and talk to colleagues. And I happened to have the good fortune of having a relationship with a guy named Alan Marlatt, who was a giant in the addictive behaviors research field. And Alan, I shared with him my quandary, and he said to me, "You're doing harm reduction." That was in 1994. And he introduced me to this alternative model. For me, that was like my spiritual reawakening or liberation from this other model that seemed to be really hamstringing me and the field. for me then, the harm reduction framework seemed to offer a whole other vision for how we can set up helping relationships. And from 1994 till today, I've been on this journey of developing what I call integrative harm reduction psychotherapy, or we might say really an approach to supporting people with addictive behaviors that's framed by harm reduction principles, which I can share with you. But I want to share another part of my story.
Please.
Because, and I only began talking about this about 3 years ago, when I realized that it was important for me to share more personally. About 10 years into my professional journey of developing this harm reduction approach to therapy, in my own personal therapy, I reconnected with an experience that I had when I was 15 years old, that I had completely dissociated, basically, which was that I was in a drug treatment program when I was 14 and 15. It was a non-residential therapeutic community that had been started by Daytop Village graduates and based on Daytop Village principles, which basically were break them down so you can build them up again. And at the age of 15, after being, I was voluntarily in the program, I broke a rule, and what had been a kind of wonderful, supportive environment for me turned into hell. And I became the target of the most disgusting verbal assault from the staff and the senior people in the program. Humiliating, shaming tactics, wearing a sign, having to scrub the toilets with a toothbrush, being taken off of all of the jobs that I had had, losing my status in the program. And I went through a process of being shell-shocked. It was like what had been a safe environment suddenly became what felt like an environment that wanted to kill me, psychically, emotionally. And I started to kind of find my voice and I thought it was about, being honest and expressing your feelings, and I started to talk about how I felt attacked and betrayed, and they just upped the ante. And they brought in more people to pound me down, and after 10 months, I became what's called a splittee. I left the program. It's like leaving a cult. From the moment I left, I was completely cut off from this community. Imagine, at the age of 15, I was starting a new high school. I left it behind, but I wound up having difficulty in high school. I became a high school dropout. Luckily, I found schools that could kind of be a safe landing spot for me, and I was able to kind of get back on track. But I suffered tremendously as a result of that, with kind of anxiety and public speaking anxiety that only much later was I able to relate to that experience. And I thought that I should begin talking about this because I've come to really think about that as what I call treatment trauma. And it occurred to me that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that have experienced a version of this that we need to kind of give a name to, and we as a field need to begin to address and help people start to heal. Just lastly, I think another part of my story, though, is how these kind of traumatic experiences can be transformed into creative, positive action. And that's really been a major part of the fuel for my own passion to help the field develop more compassionate, more effective, accepting ways of helping. When we've experienced a trauma, the work on the trauma doesn't make the pain go away, but it makes the pain make sense. And we can connect the feelings to the actual experience such that we can learn to live with those feelings and become more emotionally whole or integrated, and kind of be able to be more emotionally fully present. And that's been a big part of my journey, and even in, if you can imagine the trauma that I experienced happened in a group. So here I am, this 15-year-old, and I was one of the youngest people in the program, being verbally attacked and assaulted by a group. So then I start a profession where I'm standing in front of large groups of people trying to tell my truth. What I've now come to realize is that I was actually reworking the trauma by trying to find my voice and be able to express it in a more open and vulnerable way. And so part of my own healing has been around, finding this work, developing this work, and kind of sharing this work, which, actually I think that that's part of the healing process that takes place in 12-step meetings, where you get to tell your story and you get to have an experience of being safe, being heard, being identified with, in a way that, whatever the earlier experiences are that, contributed to the difficulties that could get, expressed or tied up with addiction, get to have a new experience around it that can help you learn to live with those feelings rather than have to stuff them and escape from them and, with some addictive process or drugs or alcohol.
You move somewhere else.
Well, so I've moved to a place where I can be more present, and open. When I told you I was introduced to, or I had a relationship with Alan Marlatt, who introduced me to this harm reduction philosophy, he also introduced me to the small but growing harm reduction community. And so, and New York was and still is one of the, one of the birthplaces of American harm reduction. So I was introduced to my support group. In a way, I've thought that the harm reduction community has been my fellowship, or one of my kind of spiritual families. And by the way, I don't know how familiar you are with it, but many of the people that are leaders in the harm reduction world are in 12-step recovery. So even from the beginning, this idea that abstinence and recovery are split from harm reduction, it's never been true. And now I think, and you may have spoken to some of these people in your interviews, people are starting to come out of the closet as recovering people that are, firmly committed and passionately committed to harm reduction. But because I immediately found a community that could support me, I felt kind of supported and empowered. And maybe because I don't know, I have gotten very, very little kickback or criticism or controversy around my work. And it might be because my style is about building bridges and about honoring all the traditions. And unfortunately, there are many people in our field that are kind of ideologues who are interested in bashing this way or that way, or polarizing or splitting. My feeling has always been that if there's a healing tradition that is helpful to some people, we should honor and embrace and support that tradition. And it's really one of the, I think, parts of my philosophy that contributes to why I call my work integrative harm reduction psychotherapy. You know, for me, the harm reduction frame is a frame that is based on the notion that we need to create a helping environment or a helping process that's going to be really oriented toward the very specific, unique needs, strengths, motivation, goals of the person that we're trying to be helpful to. And what that means is that we need to be radically committed to keeping our own values and our own agendas out of the way. Because if we're going to start foisting our agendas and values on the person we're trying to help, it contaminates things. It sets up a problem for the person in that either they're going to submit to our authority or they're going to have to rebel in order to have a sense of autonomy. So I think to be maximally helpful, we need to keep our stuff over here. This may have worked for me, but I need to clear it out of the way so that I can actually listen to who you are, and together we can collaboratively figure out what's going to work for you, given your biology, your psychology, your relationships, your culture, your motivation. And then we can pull from all of the different traditions of psychotherapy, of self-help, of complementary healing practices to put together, a recovery pathway or a positive change process that's going to be uniquely tailored to you. And the basic foundation, if we start where you are with empathy, respect, acceptance, compassion, that's going to be conducive to us creating a strong alliance where we're working together to support you on your journey. And that's what I think much of traditional addiction treatment has really left out. If the program has this way of operating, it's going to speak to this many people. But if the program is open to offering as many possible ways of operating as there are people, we can then extend the reach of treatment to the entire group of people. So in 2003, I wrote a paper called Harm Reduction Psychotherapy, Extending the Reach of Traditional Treatment. We can keep traditional treatments that work for many people, but open the doors to all of those folks that have not been there because they don't have an abstinence goal, maybe they're not even ready to take action around change, but they are ready to begin thinking about it, talking about it, working on it. In a way, some people have said the 12-step program was one of the first harm reduction programs because, AA doesn't require people to stop drinking in order to show up. It doesn't require behavior change. It just requires that you show up. And that's what harm reduction says. If you want to show up around working on your depression, working on your homelessness, working on your relationship, working on getting healthy, working on your drug use, working toward abstinence, great, let's partner with you right there. That becomes the glue. And now we can create a relationship that can move toward quantum change.
It seems to me that the idea of stigma goes away under this scenario.
Well, that's a wonderful observation, because if we are all products of a society that has stigmatized addiction, that stigma lives inside of all of us. And I really think that one of the most fundamental things that any of us can do as people that care and want to be helpful is to ferret that out, to be willing to look at how our own stigma can contaminate our ability to really listen and to see the person clearly. And so that, I think, is one of the fundamental requirements of helping. And if we're going to be radically committed to putting our own agendas and values aside, it means that we're going to try to keep the stigma out of the way, manage our fear. I once said at a training in the Philippines, which I've given trainings there several times, that I may not want you to be injecting drugs. I may not want you to be doing things that are harmful to you. I have my personal values. I really would like to help people make the most positive change, healthy choices that they can. But that doesn't mean that I can't meet you exactly where you are with compassion, with respect and empathy, to support you on your journey. And we don't have to know the destination to begin the journey. Let's just help people get started. It's an anti-stigma attitude.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, AA is 80-something years old. The field of recovery started when?
1994.
1994.
So actually my journey started, we might say, when I was 15 years old in that treatment program. But I started in the field of addictions in 1982. So it was then 1994 that I was introduced to harm reduction. I think I had been doing it for several years before I had a name for it.
From here, what is left for you to do to get where you think you want to get to?
I think that what you're doing is so important. Is what has to happen. That is, we have to have more and more ways of educating the public, of educating our country. And I think it's also a global challenge. In a new, more kind of expansive, more complex way of understanding what we call addiction. This idea that addiction is not simply a biological disease, it's not simply a spiritual disease. It is a multiply determined, very complex process that require that I think is really we could think of it as reflecting this complex interplay of biological, psychological, relationship, and cultural and social factors that interact in ways that are unique for each person, giving rise to this addictive response, essentially to suffering. And there's all sorts of ways that we humans suffer. And when that suffering becomes unbearable, we turn desperately to ways of trying to manage and comfort and stay sane in the moment that may have terribly harmful consequences. But in the moment when we have no other options, we're going to turn there. And that's a different way of thinking about addiction as a response to suffering that then can become deeply ingrained and encoded in the brain and in habit and in all of our relationships. But this new model, I think, offers a very different way of thinking about helping people make positive change that I think is much more hopeful. Because if we can identify the various strands of suffering, of biological impact, of habit, the changes in the brain, that we can rewire, we can then come up with a whole variety of solutions that I think can inspire hope. So I think getting this idea out that there's a different way of thinking about this that implies lots and lots of new tools and strategies and ways that we can support people in making change is what is going to ultimately support a scientific revolution. We have great treatments. We have these wonderful ideas. We also need to create a movement, a social movement in this country that is going to demand that our political leaders get on board and make these treatments available to people, regardless of their ability to pay, because most of the country has no access to good treatment. And that's not because of this science, it's because of a lack of political will. We're losing 200 people to lethal overdose every day in this country. I mean, over the last several years. We've lost 200,000 people to lethal overdose in the last 3 or 4 years. That's equivalent to a 9/11 every 3 weeks. After 9/11, the entire world changed. Billions and billions and billions of dollars have been put into, our security measures, our military. It's changed the world, and yet we are losing a 9/11 every 3 weeks, and our political leaders are kind of saying, oh, it's a crisis, but there's no action. So I think there's getting the message out, there's galvanizing the populace to support change, and then putting pressure on our leaders to support it with the resources that we need to make that change.
Anything that I haven't remembered to ask you that you feel is important?
Yeah, I think that in the face of this crisis, and it's unfortunate that it may take crisis to shake us out of old, failed ideas and strategies. I think that all over the country, in all sectors, among all stakeholders, people are starting to wake up to these new ideas that I'm talking about. We're seeing, the traditional recovery community and the harm reduction community shaking hands and seeing that this is actually a continuum of care. It's not different kind of communities. We're seeing in some communities political leadership actually getting mobilized to make the treatments that we need available.
Police too.
Police in all over the country. Police, we're starting to recognize that we need to stop punishing and incarcerating, and we need to start supporting and helping, and that's coming up with deflection and drug courts and police chiefs that are supporting people and getting into care. So there's a real positive movement in the face of all of this that I feel is very inspiring and very hopeful. I was pleasantly surprised, actually, at the last Cape Cod Symposium on addictive disorders, that my proposal was accepted. And when I got there, I was even more surprised to see that there were 8 presentations on harm reduction, stages of change, sort of new ways of thinking, trauma-informed care. It's like a community that had been more, I think, narrow in its focus has been expanding to include more and more of these voices. And we're seeing that all over. Many pathways to recovery is now becoming a kind of rallying cry. And that's very hopeful and inspiring to me. So I think we're on the right track. And we have a lot more work to do.